The wind came down off the caprock that evening like it had a grudge against everything still standing. Caleb Turner had made camp beside a dry creek bed 17 miles south of the Canadian River crossing in a shallow depression, where the land cupped itself just enough to break the worst of the gusts. 82 head of longhorn cattle rested in a loose sprawl around him, their breathing slow and collective in the cooling air, their shapes dark against the fading amber of the western sky. The fire he had built was small. Caleb built small fires. A man alone on the Texas Panhandle in the autumn of 1874 did not advertise himself to the dark. He was working a frayed length of rope when Dust raised her head. The old mare did not spook. She was 17 years old and had long since stopped spooking at things that were merely dangerous. What she did was lift her nose into the wind and hold it there, her ears swiveling forward with the slow deliberation of an animal that had survived this long by being careful about what deserved her attention. Caleb set the rope down. His left hand moved to the stock of the rifle lying beside him before his mind had fully formed the thought. He did not look toward Dust. He looked toward the darkness beyond the southern edge of the firelight, where the caprock dropped away, and the land opened into something vast and indifferent and very old. Nothing moved. The fire snapped once and settled lower. One of the young steers shifted its weight and exhaled, and the sound of it was like a door being pulled shut in a distant room. Then she stepped into the light. She stopped at the exact boundary where the firelight ended and the dark began, as though she understood the significance of that line and had chosen deliberately not to cross it without permission. She was young, somewhere in her early 20s, and she was wearing a gray cotton dress that had been made for a larger woman. The dress hung wrong on her shoulders, and the hem was torn ragged at the bottom and caked with the orange clay of the Panhandle earth. Her hair was black and heavy with trail dust pulled back, but coming loose, framing a face that was all clean bone and careful stillness. On her left wrist, just visible below the sleeve, there was a circular scar, raised and deliberate, the mark of something that had been done with intention and not regret. She did not beg. She did not explain. She did not look at the rifle. She looked at Caleb Turner, and she said in English so clean it had no accent to it at all, "May I warm up by your fire?" Caleb studied her the way he studied weather. Not with fear, not with hostility, but with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that the things most likely to kill you on the Texas plains were the things that arrived quietly and without announcement. He looked for the shape of a lie in her face and did not find one. He looked for the trembling of someone who had made a desperate calculation and found only the steadiness of someone who had already moved past desperation into something harder and quieter on the other side of it. He reached for the second tin cup. It was an old cup dented at the rim with a handle that had been straightened once after being bent in some accident he no longer remembered. He had carried it for 3 years in the left pocket of his saddlebag, and in 3 years he had never once poured anything into it. It had simply ridden there, taking up space that could have been used for something else, and he had never been able to make himself remove it. He filled it from the blue enamel pot and set it on the ground between them, not close to him, not close to her. In the middle distance where the firelight was weakest and the shadows were uncertain. He did not say anything. He did not invite her forward. He simply set the cup down and returned his eyes to the fire. After a moment he heard her boots move in the dirt. Soft steps, unhurried. She crouched on the far side of the fire, still outside what most people would have considered a comfortable social distance, and she reached forward and picked up the cup with both hands the way people pick up things they are afraid might vanish if handled carelessly. Caleb watched the fire. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was not frightened in the way that people who have been running are frightened, with their eyes moving and their breath shallow and their hands needing something to hold. She held the cup, and she was still. And the stillness in her was the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a skill, and not simply an absence of motion. "Naya," she said. He looked up. She was watching him over the rim of the cup. "That is my name, if you were wondering." "Caleb," he said. She nodded once as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. The cattle breathed around them. The fire burned down by another inch. The sky above the Texas Panhandle was extraordinary in the way that skies are extraordinary when there is nothing between you and them but open land and cold air, a field of stars so dense and close it seemed less like looking up and more like looking into something. Caleb Turner was 34 years old. He had owned his ranch south of Abilene for 9 years, first with his father and then alone, and for the past 3 years he had worked it in a silence that had started as grief and gradually, without his quite noticing, had become simply the way he lived. He had brought 82 head of longhorn cattle up out of the southern grass country, and he was driving them north along the western trail to Dodge City, Kansas, a distance of roughly 600 miles, because the payment on his bank loan was due in November, and this was the only arithmetic that solved the problem. He had not hired extra hands because extra hands cost money he did not have. He had packed light. He had planned carefully. He had set out alone the way he did most things, and he had not questioned the wisdom of this because the alternative was to question it and find no better answer. The second tin cup had gone into the saddlebag without conscious decision. He had reached for it on the morning he left and put it in the bag before he fully understood what he was doing, and by the time he understood the moment for removing, it had passed. He did not think about this often. He was thinking about it now. Naya finished the coffee and held the empty cup in both hands, the way she had held it full, as though the warmth still lived in the metal even after the liquid was gone. She was looking at the fire, not at him, and there was something in her profile that was composed of two different faces, imperfectly layered, a Kiowa face in the structure of the bones, and a something else face in the expression that lived on top of it, an expression that had been educated somewhere and had the habit of European thought patterns in it, alongside something much older and more careful. He was about to ask where she had come from when he saw it. On the crest of the low ridge that rose to the south of the camp, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, there was a flicker of orange light. It lasted no more than a second, the brief, bright suggestion of a flame before it was extinguished or covered the way a man covers a torch when he realizes he has been seen. Caleb did not move. He did not change his expression. He continued looking at the fire in front of him as though he had seen nothing, and in his peripheral vision he watched Naya to see if she had noticed. Her hands tightened slightly on the empty cup. Just slightly. Just enough. She had noticed. He looked back toward the ridge. There was nothing there now, only the dark and the wind moving through the dry grass, and the vast indifference of the Panhandle night pressing down on everything equally. He did not ask her about it. She did not mention it. They sat together in the silence that had fallen between them, which was not an easy silence, and not yet a comfortable one, but which had at its edges the faint suggestion of something that might eventually become either of those things. When the fire burned down far enough that letting it die seemed wasteful, Caleb added a careful measure of mesquite and watched the flames strengthen. He pointed to the far side of the camp without looking at her. "You sleep there," he said. "I'll be here. We move at first light." Naya looked at where he pointed. Then she stood and walked to the edge of the firelight on that side of camp and lay down with her carpetbag under her head and pulled her knees to her chest against the cold. Caleb sat with his back against his saddle and his rifle across his lap, and he did not sleep. He watched the ridge to the south where the light had flickered and gone out. Nothing came. But nothing going was not the same as nothing being there. At some point before dawn, with the stars still thick and cold overhead and the cattle motionless in the dark around him, Caleb Turner looked at the second tin cup sitting empty at the edge of the firelight where Naya had left it, and he thought about his wife, and he thought about the distance between Abilene and Dodge City, and he thought about all the things he had packed for this journey and all the things he had not. He did not sleep. But somewhere in the hours before the sky began to change in the east for the first time in a very long time, the silence around him did not feel entirely like something that had been taken away. He smelled the coffee before he opened his eyes. Caleb had developed over 3 years of solitude a finely calibrated awareness of mornings. He knew the precise quality of the light at each stage of dawn, knew the sequence in which the cattle would begin to stir, knew the temperature of the air against his face at each hour before sunrise. What he did not know What had no place in the careful arithmetic of his solitary mornings was the smell of coffee that he had not yet made. He opened his eyes. Naya was crouching beside the rebuilt fire, her back straight, one hand holding the blue enamel pot steady above the flame with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years working over open fires in conditions that did not permit impatience or inattention. She was not looking at him. She was looking east, where the first pale suggestion of morning was beginning to separate the land from the sky, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone watching something they had not decided yet whether to trust. She had been up, Caleb estimated, for at least an hour, in a strange camp, in someone else's territory, without having been asked. He sat up slowly the way a man sits up when his back has spent the night against a saddle, and he looked at her without speaking for a long moment. She had dressed in the dark. The gray dress was arranged as neatly as its condition permitted. Her hair had been repinned with what appeared to be 3 salvaged thorns from a mesquite branch. She had not borrowed anything of his. She had not moved anything of his. The camp was exactly as he had left it, except that the fire was burning and the coffee was nearly ready, and the first light of the Texas morning was beginning to come down across the caprock in long horizontal stripes of pale gold. "Figured I would start earning that $1," she said without turning around. Caleb stood and walked to the edge of camp where he saw to the business of the morning, and then came back and accepted the cup she held out to him, the ordinary cup this time, and drank from it standing up while he looked at the ridge to the south. Nothing. But the nothing felt different in daylight, more deliberate. After the cattle were watered and the camp was broken, he made her his offer, $1 a day. 4 weeks to Dodge City. Meals included such as they were. She would ride the left flank. She would do exactly what he told her to do when he told her to do it, and ask her questions afterward. She was not there as a guest and not there as a charity case, and if she decided at any point that the terms were not acceptable, she could say so, and they would part ways with no ill feeling on his side. He said all of this while he was saddling Dust without looking at Naya in the flat, matter-of-fact tone he used for practical arrangements. She said yes before he had finished the last sentence. Fast. The kind of fast that told him she had been considering something worse than this, and that this was the better option by a margin that precluded deliberation. He finished saddling Dust. Then he looked at her. "You said you can ride." "Yes." "Where did you learn?" Something moved in her face, not quite a shadow and not quite a smile, the brief passage of a memory that contained both. "From my father. He said a horse can read your intention before you know it yourself." Caleb considered this. It was in his experience true. "Can you read cattle?" "I grew up around horses and dogs. Cattle are slower to decide but harder to redirect once they have." He nodded. It was a considered answer, not a boastful one, and it corresponded to everything he knew about cattle. He brought out his older horse, a broad-shouldered brown gelding named Rem, that he had planned to use as a spare, and saddled him without ceremony, and handed Naya the reins. She checked the saddle the way an experienced rider checks a saddle, which is with her hands and not her eyes, feeling the tightness of the cinch and the lie of the blanket beneath. And then she swung up in a single motion that was economical and unhesitating, and told him more about her history than anything she had said. "Left flank," he said. "Watch the red brindle. She wants to lead, but she picks the wrong direction when she does." Naya looked across the herd until she found the red brindle, studied her, nodded. They moved out. The Texas Panhandle in October has a quality of light that does not exist anywhere else on the continent. It comes down from a sky that is too large by any reasonable measure, too blue, too absolute in its blueness, and it falls across the grass in a way that makes everything it touches look simultaneously very close and very far away. The land is flat but not featureless, cut through with dry creek beds and sudden shallow canyons, and the long, low ridges of the caprock, and in the morning light all of it takes on the quality of something seen in a painting, where the painter has decided that the world contains more beauty than is strictly necessary or comfortable. Caleb rode the right flank and watched Naya work. She did not chatter. She did not ask for reassurance. When two young steers drifted left, she moved to correct them with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that cattle respond to pressure applied at the right angle and the right moment, and not before. When the red brindle tested the front of the formation, she read it 3 seconds before it happened and was already in position when it did, cutting across at exactly the angle needed to turn the cow back into the body of the herd without drama. Caleb watched all of this without comment. By mid-morning they had covered 8 miles, and the cattle had settled into the rhythm that good cattle find on a good drive, a steady, purposeful movement that has its own momentum and its own logic and requires maintenance rather than forcing. The sky was clear. The wind was out of the southwest, which was a good wind for a northbound drive. The grass was dry but adequate. It was by the measure of cattle drives a good morning. At noon they rested the herd near a shallow depression where rainwater had pooled and the grass was slightly greener. Caleb dismounted and let Dust drink and eat. Naya rode a slow circle around the resting cattle, checking the edges before she dismounted and led Rem to water. Caleb was eating cold cornbread from his saddlebag when she came and stood nearby, not close enough to be presumptuous, not far enough to be distant. "The red brindle favors her right shoulder," Naya said. "She drifts left because pushing off her right hurts. She is not trying to lead. She is trying to keep her shoulder from bearing weight." Caleb looked at the red brindle, who was standing apart from the others, in the way that animals in mild pain sometimes stand, slightly separate, slightly turned. He had been driving cattle for 15 years, and he had not noticed this. He ate the rest of the cornbread without speaking, considering what it meant that she had noticed something he had not, and what it meant that she had told him about it plainly and without making anything of the telling. "Her name is Clara," he said finally. Naya looked at him. "The brindle. My daughter named her." He paused. "My daughter did not survive her first winter. But the cow did." He did not know why he said this. He had not said it to anyone in 3 years. It sat in the air between them for a moment, and then the wind took it away across the dry grass. Naya said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I will watch her shoulder." That was all. No sympathy offered and no sympathy refused, just the acknowledgement of a fact and the practical response to it, and Caleb thought that this was exactly the right thing to say, and almost no one would have said it. They moved the herd out again at mid-afternoon. It was toward the end of the driving day, when the light was going amber and long and the cattle were beginning to think about stopping, that Caleb saw it. On the crest of the same low ridge to the south, a single rider sat motionless against the sky. Not the flickering suggestion of firelight hidden quickly. A rider, present and visible, and not attempting concealment, sitting his horse with the particular stillness of someone making a deliberate statement through their visibility rather than being revealed accidentally. The distance was perhaps 400 yards, far enough that the details of the rider were indistinct, but close enough to see that the horse was a paint, and that the rider sat in the Kiowa manner, which is different from the way white riders sit, different from the way cowboys sit. A particular relationship between the body and the horse that speaks of a lifetime of riding, learned not from instruction, but from immersion. Caleb looked at the rider. Then he looked at Naya. Naya was looking straight ahead. Her back was straight. Her hands on the reins were relaxed. Nothing in her posture said she had seen the rider on the ridge. But the angle of her head was wrong by 2 degrees, and Caleb Turner had spent too many years reading animals and weather and land and the subtle misdirections of things that knew they were being watched to miss 2 degrees. She had seen. The rider on the ridge sat for 3 full minutes while the herd moved north below him, long enough that the cattle closest to that side of the formation began to shift uneasily, reading something in the air that their smaller nervous systems registered before the humans did. Then the rider turned his horse and rode back over the ridge and was gone. Naya adjusted her angle to correct for 2 steers drifting left. She did not look at the ridge. That evening, after the cattle were settled and the fire was going and the coffee had been made a second time, Caleb waited until they had both eaten and the darkness had fully arrived before he spoke. "Who was that?" Naya held her cup in both hands and looked at the fire for a long moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. Then she set the cup down carefully on the flat ground beside her. "Someone from my people," she said. "The Kiowa, from the band I was born into. They are following you." "Yes." "How many?" "At least 2, possibly 3. She paused. "They have been following me since before I found your fire." Caleb absorbed this. "What do they want?" She was quiet again. The fire shifted and a column of sparks rose and scattered and went out in the dark air above them. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone selecting words with care, not because she was hiding anything, but because she wanted to be accurate. "There is a man, my father's son from another woman. His name is Red Hawk. When my father died, Red Hawk became the leader of our band." She stopped, started again. "He wants something from me, something I carry, and he wants me to stop carrying it." "What do you carry?" "Not tonight," she said, not evasively and not with fear in it, the way someone says not tonight when they need to be sure of the ground before they put their full weight on it. Caleb nodded. He looked toward the south where the ridge was now only a darker shape against the dark sky. 2 people, he said. "At least." He reached over and moved the rifle closer to his right hand. A practical adjustment, not a dramatic one the way you close a window when the weather is changing without making anything of it. "We move at first light," he said. She picked up her cup again and drank the last of the coffee, and across the fire he could see her hands, which had stopped being entirely steady at some point during the conversation and were now steady again. And he thought that steadiness of that kind, the kind that is recovered rather than native, is a different thing entirely from a steadiness that has never been tested and is perhaps worth more. He was thinking about this, and about the rider on the ridge, and about the second tin cup that was sitting between them again, where she had left it, when he noticed something he had not noticed before. Naya's carpet bag was open slightly at the top. She had reached into it for something earlier, and had not pulled the drawstring fully closed. Inside the bag, visible in the firelight, was a small rolled cylinder of what appeared to be tanned leather, tied with a thin cord of sinew. It was the size of a man's fist, and its surface was marked with lines in a dark pigment, the suggestion of a drawing or a map, precise and intentional, and very deliberately made. She followed his eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she pulled the drawstring closed. Caleb looked back at the fire. He said nothing. She said nothing. The cattle breathed around them in the dark, 82 animals resting in the particular animal faith that tomorrow will arrive and be managed as tomorrow has always been managed, by moving forward and dealing with what is present. He banked the fire and lay back on his bedroll with the rifle beside him, and the stars enormous and cold above, and the wind moving across the caprock in long, slow sighs. Naya was asleep within 10 minutes. He could tell by her breathing, which changed and deepened in the way that the breathing of someone genuinely exhausted changes when they finally allow themselves to rest, when the body overrules whatever the mind is still trying to calculate and pulls the whole apparatus down into sleep, whether it is ready or not. He did not sleep. Before the stars had moved an hour across the sky, Caleb got up quietly and walked south through the sleeping cattle, threading between their warm bulk and their slow breathing, until he had cleared the edge of the camp. He walked south another 200 yards in the dark, with the rifle in his hand, moving carefully across ground he could not see until he reached the base of the low ridge. He crouched and looked along the ground toward the south. After a moment his eyes adjusted enough to find what he was looking for. 50 yards to the west, at the base of the ridge, there were 2 small circles of disturbed ash on the ground. They were cold, both of them. 2 separate fires built small and close to the earth, the kind of fires built for warmth with no excess. The ash was cold, but not ancient. Last night or the night before. Close enough that on a still night a careful man sleeping at the edge of his own camp could have smelled them if the wind had been different. Caleb crouched over the nearer ash circle and looked at it for a while. 2 fires. 2 people. Not moving away. Moving parallel, keeping pace, staying south. He stood and looked north toward his camp where Naya was sleeping, and the banked fire was a faint orange suggestion in the dark. He walked back through the cattle and lay back down on his bedroll and looked up at the stars. He thought about the leather cylinder in Naya's bag with its lines of dark pigment that might be a map or might be something else entirely. He thought about the rider on the ridge who had stayed visible long enough to be sure of being seen and then had ridden away without haste. He thought about the way Naya had closed her carpet bag and said nothing, and the way he had looked back at the fire and said nothing, and how between the two of them they had arrived at a silence that was not avoidance, but was instead the careful agreement of two people deciding independently and simultaneously that some things needed more ground beneath them before they could be carried. In the morning there were 2 cold circles of ash in the dirt that had not been there the day before. Caleb found them on his dawn patrol of the camp's perimeter, just as he found them every morning walking the edge of the herd before the light was fully up. He stood over them for a moment looking south. Then he walked back to camp where Naya had already rebuilt the fire and the coffee was nearly ready and the first light of the October morning was coming across the caprock in those long horizontal stripes of pale gold that made the world ahead of them look both reachable and very far from anything either of them had left behind. She handed him the cup without ceremony. He took it. 2, he said. She looked at him. She understood immediately what he meant. Yes, she said. He drank the coffee. She drank hers. The cattle began to stir in the growing light, shifting and rising with the slow certainty of animals whose lives have a direction, even when the animals themselves do not fully understand what that direction is or where it leads. Caleb handed back the empty cup and went to saddle dust. There were 600 miles between where he stood and Dodge City, Kansas, and somewhere in those miles was a debt that needed paying and a payment that needed making, and an arithmetic that he had worked out carefully before he left, and that still this morning added up to the only answer available to him. He cinched the saddle and checked the rifle and looked south one more time at the ridge where the rider had stood against the sky, and then he turned dust north and clicked his tongue, and they moved. Behind him he heard the sound of Naya swinging up onto Rem, the creak of leather, and the quiet thud of hooves finding purchase in the dry October ground. They rode out together into the morning. Neither of them spoke. But the silence between them, which had begun the night before, as the silence of 2 strangers arriving at the same fire from different directions, had shifted in the small hours of the darkness into something with a different quality. Entirely. The silence of 2 people who have looked at the same evidence and drawn the same conclusion and understood without discussing it that the road ahead contains something neither of them has fully accounted for. Ahead of them, Dodge City was 600 miles away, and the sky was very blue and very large. Behind them, somewhere to the south, 2 cold circles of ash were the only evidence that the night had not been as empty as it looked. The sky turned the wrong color at noon. Caleb had been watching it since mid-morning, the way a man watches a horse that is not yet lame but is beginning to favor one leg with a quiet and sustained attention that does not announce itself. The blue had been going out of it since breakfast, replaced by a flat white that thickened as the hours passed, and by noon the white had begun to carry at its western edge a tinge of green that had no business being there. He had seen that green once before. He had been 19 years old and working his father's cattle south of San Angelo when the sky went that particular shade of wrong, and in the space of 40 minutes the storm that followed had killed 11 head of cattle and taken the roof off the barn his father had built with his own hands over the course of 2 summers. The barn had been rebuilt. The cattle had been replaced eventually. But the green in the sky had stayed with him the way that certain things stay with you, not as memory exactly, but as a kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, so that when he saw it again 25 years later above the Texas Panhandle, his hands tightened on the reins before he had consciously identified what he was seeing. He looked across the herd at Naya. She was already looking at the sky. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled a short, sharp sound that meant tighten up, which Naya had learned in the first 2 days of the drive the same way she had learned everything else about working cattle, by watching what the sound preceded and connecting the cause to the effect without requiring an explanation. She began pushing the left flank inward, immediately compressing the herd into a tighter formation, and Caleb worked the right side in the same motion, and between the 2 of them, the herd went from a loose traveling formation to something denser and more manageable in less than 10 minutes. The wind shifted at 1 o'clock. It had been coming from the southwest all morning, steady and mild and smelling of dry grass and the distant suggestion of dust. When it shifted, it came around to the northwest and brought with it a coldness that was not the ordinary cold of an October afternoon on the Panhandle, but something more committed and intentional. A cold that was traveling with the storm behind it, the way a herald travels ahead of an army to announce what is coming and to make clear that what is coming does not require your permission. The cattle felt it. Their ears began moving small, constant adjustments, the way ears move when the signals they are receiving are contradictory, and the brain behind them has not yet resolved the contradiction into an appropriate response. Their bodies tightened. The low sound that ran through the herd was not mooing exactly, but something more involuntary, the audible evidence of 8,000 pounds of collective anxiety looking for a direction. "Keep them tight," Caleb called across. Naya nodded. She was already riding wider, extending her position to the left to account for the steers at the back of the formation who were beginning to drift. The first thunder came at 2 o'clock. Far off, a low, rolling sound that the Panhandle terrain carried for miles, so that it arrived stripped of its urgency, a rumor of something rather than the thing itself. But the cattle knew what it was. Cattle always know. The herd moved as a single nervous body, a ripple running through it from the back to the front, like the ripple that runs through tall grass when the wind changes direction. Caleb checked the sky. The green had moved east. In its place was a darkness that was building on the western horizon with the accelerating certainty of something that has been gathering itself for a long time and has now decided to stop gathering and simply arrive. He thought about the lay of the land to the north. There was a broad, shallow draw perhaps 3 miles ahead where the ground dropped away on all sides and offered some shelter. Not much, but some enough to keep a panicked herd from running into open ground where they could scatter for miles. If they could reach it before the storm hit, they would have a chance of holding the formation through the worst of it. He clicked dust into a faster walk and whistled the signal for increased pace and watched the herd begin to move with more urgency, and across the left flank he could see Naya leaning slightly forward in the saddle, reading the same situation and making the same calculation, pushing Rem into a faster gait to hold the edge of the compressed herd in place as it began to move faster. The second thunder came 15 minutes later, and it was not far off. It hit the air with a concussive authority that made the ground vibrate in a way you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, and the cattle responded with the pure, uncalculated physics of mass panic. The herd lurched forward and to the right simultaneously, the front animals accelerating and the rear animals piling into them, and the whole formation losing whatever order it had maintained, as the individual animals stopped being a herd and started being 82 separate animals, each in the grip of the oldest instruction in their nervous systems, which is to run from the thing that sounds like it is about to kill you. 82 longhorn cattle in full stampede is not, as people who have not witnessed it sometimes imagine, a dramatic and spectacular thing. It is a fundamental thing. It is the feeling of the earth itself becoming unreliable beneath your feet, a vibration that is also a sound, that is also a physical pressure against your body, and within it, the individual animal disappears entirely into the collective momentum of a thing that has no mind and no direction, and no concern for anything in its path. Caleb had been in stampedes before. He had learned what most men who survive their first stampede learn, which is that the worst thing you can do is run away from it, and the second worst thing is to run directly into it. And the only thing that works is to work the edges with patience and consistent pressure and bend the panic back into itself until the circle tightens and the animals run into each other and slow each other down, and gradually, over minutes that feel much longer than minutes, the thing that had no mind recovers one. He rode hard to the right flank, dust moving with the trust of an animal that has worked cattle for 17 years and knows this work in her body the way a musician knows music. And he pushed into the edge of the running mass with a steady, lateral pressure, not fighting the current, but redirecting it. The way you redirect a river, not by building a wall across it, but by introducing an angle that changes where it wants to go. Across the chaos, he could see Naya on the left side doing the same thing. She was riding hard, her body low over Rem's neck, her hat gone somewhere in the first seconds of the stampede, her hair loose and streaming back, and she was working the left edge with the same lateral pressure and the same patient redirection, and even at that distance and in that noise and confusion, Caleb could see that she was not afraid. She was working. There is a particular quality of attention that good working riders have in crisis situations that is different from the attention of someone who is frightened. And Naya had it that quality of total presence that means all of the person is available to the problem in front of them, and nothing is being held back for the management of fear. The lightning came then. It struck the caprock to the west with a white violence that turned the afternoon into noon for a fractured second and printed on the air a smell of burnt ozone and something else, something older, the smell of power operating at a scale that makes human arrangements feel provisional. The thunder that followed was not a sound so much as a physical event, a compression of the air that hit the chest like a shove and left behind a ringing that was also a silence. The cattle surged. The entire mass of the herd lurched simultaneously to the northeast, and the formation that Caleb and Naya had been carefully bending back toward itself came apart in a way that required starting over from the beginning, and for 30 seconds the only thing either of them could do was stay with their horses and stay out from under the hooves and wait for the wave to pass. In those 30 seconds, Caleb saw the calf go down. It was one of the youngest, barely 4 months old, the calf that Naya had been keeping watch over since the first day, because it had been born slightly small and had been running at the edge of its capacity since the drive began. It went down at the center of the stampede, its legs folding under it, in the way that young legs fold when they have been pushed past what they can sustain, and the herd closed over it immediately, the way water closes over a stone. Caleb saw it and assessed it in the same instant, with the unsentimental arithmetic of a man who works with cattle for a living. The calf was a financial loss, not a large one, not as large as losing even one of the mature steers, and the attempt to retrieve it from the center of a stampede was an action that offered a very low probability of success and a very high probability of adding a human casualty to the ledger. He had done this arithmetic before. He knew what it added up to. He was opening his mouth to call to Naya to leave it when he saw that Naya was no longer on her horse. She had jumped from Rem before Rem had fully stopped hitting the ground at a run and going directly into the moving mass of the stampede toward the place where the calf had gone down. She had not called to him. She had not looked at him. She had seen the calf fall, and she had made her decision in the space between one breath and the next, and she had gone. Caleb said something that was not a word and drove dust hard into the edge of the moving herd. Inside the stampede, Naya was moving through the cattle the way someone moves through a crowd, reading the gaps and moving into them before they closed. Her body turned sideways and low, her arms against her sides, making herself as small as possible in the spaces between animals that each outweighed her by 600 pounds or more. She was not trying to fight through the herd. She was trying to move with it using its own current, finding the eddies and the slow spots the way a swimmer finds them in a river. She reached the calf in 40 seconds. It was on its side, its legs working in the frantic, purposeless motion of an animal that is trying to rise and cannot find the physics of it, its eyes showing white, its breathing fast and shallow. The hooves of the cattle around it were hitting the ground within inches of its body, each impact a near miss, the accumulated luck of it already extraordinary and running out fast. Naya went to her knees beside the calf in the dirt. She got her arms under it, one arm across its chest and one under its haunches, and she lifted. The calf was perhaps 250 pounds of panicked, wet animal, and it did not want to be lifted, and it expressed this by kicking in all 4 directions simultaneously, one hoof connecting with Naya's left shoulder with a force that snapped her sideways and nearly put her on the ground. She did not go on the ground. She absorbed the blow and shifted her grip and lifted again. Caleb reached her then. He had driven Dust into the edge of the running herd with a force that required both of them to be willing, and Dust had been willing. 17 years of willingness had made her willing. and they had pushed through the outer current of the stampede and were now inside it, which was a place Caleb had not been since he was 22 years old and had sworn afterward never to be again. He drove Dust into the cattle nearest to Naya, using the mare's broad chest as a wedge forcing a gap in the moving bodies, and he reached down and grabbed Naya's arm. She had the calf. She was not letting go of the calf. He did not argue with her. He wrapped his hand around her upper arm, and Dust pushed forward through the gap, and for a moment all three of them, the man and the woman and the calf, were part of the stampede carried in its direction by a logic they had not chosen. And then Dust found the edge and pushed through it, and they were out. They stood in the open ground beyond the edge of the running herd. Naya was on her feet barely. The calf was in her arms, its legs hanging its head against her chest. Her shoulder was bleeding through the sleeve of the gray dress. Her hair was full of dirt, and one of the mesquite thorns she had used as a hairpin was still there, and the others were gone. She was breathing hard and not steadily, and there was a look on her face that was not triumph and not relief, but something more complicated than either of those, something that had to do with having made a choice and lived with the consequence of it, and found the consequence acceptable. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. "You could have been killed," he said. His voice had come out lower than he intended. "It would have been trampled," she said. "It is a calf. It did not choose to be in the middle of a stampede." He had no answer for this. It was not the kind of statement that invited a response. It was the kind of statement that simply occupied the air and waited for the world to rearrange itself around it. The storm hit in full, then the rain arriving not gradually, but all at once, the way Panhandle rain sometimes arrives, as though a decision has been made at some administrative level and immediately implemented, and within 30 seconds they were both soaked through, and the calf was soaked, and the stampede was losing its energy in the wet, and the cattle were beginning to slow and circle in the confused way that cattle circle, when the thing they were running from is no longer clearly in front of them. They spent the next 2 hours in the rain driving the herd into the draw Caleb had been aiming for, working the edges in the mud and the diminishing light, their horses exhausted and their clothes soaked, and the world reduced to the immediate problem of getting 82 animals into a space where they could be held through the night. They got 81. One had gone in the stampede, broken away to the east in the first terrible minutes, and not been recovered. Caleb counted twice at the entrance to the draw to make sure of the number, and the second count confirmed the first, and he sat on Dust in the rain for a moment, looking at the number in his mind and calculating what it meant for the arithmetic of Dodge City, and then he rode into the draw and set about the work of making camp in the mud. That evening the rain stopped and the sky cleared with the abrupt completeness of Panhandle weather, as though the storm had simply finished its business and moved on to other obligations, leaving behind it a silence that was wet and cold and smelled of soaked earth and the particular mineral freshness of air that has been thoroughly washed. Caleb built the fire in a depression where the ground was driest. His hands moved through the familiar sequence of the task automatically, while his mind worked at the problem of the missing steer and the cost of it and the adjusted arithmetic of what remained. Naya was sitting nearby. She had attended to her shoulder as best she could with the limited supplies available, wrapping it with a strip of cloth torn from the bottom of her dress, which was already ragged enough that the loss was not significant. The calf was curled at the edge of the fire's warmth, pressed against its mother alive. Caleb finished building the fire and looked at the calf. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to his saddlebag and found the cloth he used for cleaning the rifle, and he soaked it in the canteen water and crossed back to where Naya was sitting and held it out to her without speaking. She looked at the cloth, then at him. "Your shoulder," he said. She took the cloth. He sat down across the fire from her, closer than he had sat before, close enough that the fire was between them rather than beside both of them, and he watched her press the cloth against her shoulder with an expression that was entirely internal. The expression of someone managing pain with the same methodical focus they would bring to any other problem that needed to be solved. "Why the calf?" he said. She did not answer immediately. She held the cloth against the wound and looked at the fire, and he could see her deciding not whether to answer, but how. "When I left the band," she said finally, "I left in the night. There was a dog, young, maybe 8 months old, that had attached itself to me over the course of that summer. When I left, I could not take it with me. I could not carry it, and I could not let it follow because it would have made noise." She paused. "I have thought about that dog every day since, whether someone fed it, whether it looked for me." Another pause shorter. "The calf did not choose to be in that stampede. Someone should have chosen for it." The fire shifted. A spark rose and went out. Caleb looked at the calf sleeping against its mother. He looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. "I left something behind too," he said, "when I left for this drive." He stopped. It was not the right moment, and he knew it, and he let the thought go back to wherever it had come from. Naya looked at him with the sideways attention of someone who has heard a sentence end before it was finished and is deciding whether to follow the unfinished part or let it lie. She let it lie. They ate in silence, and the night settled around them, and the cattle breathed in the dark of the draw, and the fire burned down by degrees, and neither of them moved to build it back up. It was in this quiet, with the fire low and the dark complete around them, that Naya reached into her carpet bag and took out the leather cylinder and set it on the ground between them. The dawn of the 12th day came in cold and thin, the light arriving without any of the gold that had characterized the earlier mornings of the drive, a flat gray illumination that turned the Caprock landscape into something that looked like a study for a painting rather than the painting itself. The grass was the color of old rope. The sky was the color of iron. The cattle moved through it with their heads down and their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and the sound of their hooves on the hard ground had changed a sharper sound, now the ground more unyielding as the temperature dropped. Caleb rode without speaking. He had not slept well. He had lain in his bedroll in the draw after the fire went out and looked at the sky and turned over in his mind what Naya had told him the night before, the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it, and what was underneath it was a weight that he had not fully anticipated and that required some time to carry before you could carry it without noticing the effort. She had told him everything. She had set the leather cylinder on the ground between them, and she had told him in the flat, economical voice of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times in the solitude of her own mind, the story that lived inside it. Her father, Lone Bear, had been the leader of their band for 20 years. He had been a man who understood with the particular clarity of someone who has watched the world change around him faster than he can change within it. That the world his children were being born into was not the world he had grown up in, and that survival in this new world required a different kind of intelligence than the one he had inherited. He had sent Naya to the mission school in Anadarko because he wanted her to learn to speak the language of the people who were going to determine the conditions of Kiowa existence for the foreseeable future, not because he admired those people or wished to become them, but because he was a practical man with a daughter he loved and a clear understanding of the terrain. When he died in the spring of 1873, the leadership of the band passed to Red Hawk, his son, from his first wife, a man 10 years older than Naya, who had watched his father's accommodations with the encroaching world with a contempt he had never been able to entirely conceal. Red Hawk had ambitions that required resources. Resources required territory. Territory in 1873 required alliances, and alliances in the Kiowa world of 1873 required demonstrations of power and the management of enemies, some of whom were rivals within the Kiowa nation itself. There had been a trader, a white man named Edmund Price, who traveled the southern plains buying and selling with the casual confidence of someone who believed that his racial identity constituted a kind of protection. He had come through the band's territory in the autumn of 1873, carrying a significant amount of trade goods and a letter of passage from an Indian agent in Anadarko. He had set up camp on the southern edge of Lone Bear's former territory for 3 days trading. On the 4th day, Edmund Price had disappeared. The official account which Red Hawk delivered to the Indian agent at Anadarko, with the unhurried confidence of someone who has had time to prepare it, was that Price had moved on to trade with a neighboring band of Comanche to the south, and that was the last anyone in Red Hawk's band had seen of him. The neighboring band of Comanche denied any knowledge of Price. The Indian agent conducted a brief and administratively convenient investigation and concluded that Price had likely met with an accident on the open plains, which was plausible enough that it required no further examination. But Naya had been there on the fourth night. She had been returning from collecting water at the creek when she had seen two of Red Hawk's men carrying something in the dark. She had not understood what she was seeing at first, and then she had understood, and she had gone very still in the brush beside the creek, and she had waited until they were gone before she returned to camp and lay down in her blankets and did not sleep. She had not told anyone. She was 20 years old, and she had understood with a cold clarity that the only thing standing between her and the same fate as Edmund Price was the fact that no one knew she had been at the creek that night. Lone Bear had known something. She had not told him directly, but he was her father, and he had watched her face across the fire for the weeks after Price's disappearance, and he had read in it the shape of something she was carrying. He had not asked her directly. Instead, over the course of several months, he had compiled what he knew, gathering evidence with the patience of a man who understood that evidence needed to be preserved rather than acted upon immediately, because acting upon it immediately would accomplish nothing and get him killed. He had drawn a map on a piece of tanned leather, marking the location where Price had been buried with the same careful precision he brought to marking water sources and hunting grounds. He had added his own account of what he had observed and what he suspected in a pictorial notation that Naya could read and that most white men could not. He had given it to a woman named Kiowa, the oldest person in the band, who had been his mother's closest friend and who had outlived everyone who had known her in her youth, and who had the particular authority in the band of someone so old that even Red Hawk did not wish to antagonize her unnecessarily. Kiowa had given it to Naya on the day that Red Hawk told Naya she would be married to the leader of a southern band that Red Hawk wished to ally himself with. "If Red Hawk finds this," Naya had said, looking at the leather cylinder sitting between her and Caleb on the ground, "the map goes with me. If I reach a United States Marshal, the map becomes evidence. The difference between those two outcomes is everything." Caleb had sat with this for a long time. "Not a sheriff," she had said. "A marshal, federal, not connected to the local politics of any county. Dodge City has a federal marshal." "I know." He had looked at the leather cylinder for a while longer, and then he had looked at Naya, and he had said, "Why are you telling me this?" She had met his eyes without hesitation. "Because you have been carrying a rifle sideways on your saddle since the second morning of this drive. Because you moved your bedroll 3 feet closer to the southern edge of camp on the fourth night without mentioning it. Because when you saw the ash circles, you came back and told me what you found instead of deciding it was your information to manage." She paused. "Because you put that second cup in your saddlebag and you have never once explained it, and you are not the kind of man who does things without a reason." Caleb had said nothing. "You deserve to know the truth of the person you are traveling with," she said. "That is all." He had thought about this for a long time in the dark, after she had put the cylinder away and lain down to sleep. He had thought about truth and what it cost and what it purchased, and whether the exchange was generally worth making. Now, riding through the gray morning of the 12th day, he was still thinking about it when he saw the envelope. It had worked itself out of the buckle pocket on the outside of his left saddlebag, the way things work themselves loose on long drives, when the bag has been opened and closed enough times that the buckle no longer cinches as tightly as it once did. It was lying in the grass at the edge of the trail, having fallen at some point in the last hour, and Naya, riding behind him and to his left, would have passed it on her side. He did not stop immediately. He rode 10 more feet and then turned dust back without making a production of it, as though he had simply changed his mind about the direction of a small correction to the herd's path, and he leaned from the saddle and picked up the envelope and put it back in the pocket and cinched the buckle firmly. When he straightened up, Naya was watching him. She had not passed it. She had stopped her horse 6 feet behind it and was sitting still in the saddle, looking at him with an expression that was entirely neutral, in the careful way of someone who has chosen neutrality deliberately. He rode back to his position on the right flank and did not look at her again. But he knew. They stopped at noon beside a shallow depression where the ground held water after the previous night's rain. The cattle spread and drank and grazed, and Caleb dismounted and led Dust to the water and stood beside her while she drank, his hand on her neck, feeling the working of her throat. Naya came and stood nearby with Rem, and they were quiet together for a while in the way they had become quiet together over the past 12 days, a quiet that was no longer the quiet of strangers, but was not yet anything else, a quiet that existed in the space between those two conditions and had its own particular quality. She reached into the pocket of her dress and held out the envelope. He looked at it. "It fell this morning," she said, "before the one you picked up. There were two." He had not known that. He felt the knowledge of it settle into him with a weight that was also a kind of clarity. He took the envelope. It was the same envelope he had read so many times that the fold lines had gone soft and the ink of the address had faded slightly from handling. He held it for a moment, and then he held it out toward her. She looked at him, not at the envelope. "You do not have to," she said. "I know." She took it. She read it slowly, her eyes moving through the text with the careful attention of someone reading in their second language, which her English was not, but reading another person's private correspondence required a different kind of care than reading for oneself. When she finished, she folded it back on its worn lines and gave it back to him. He put it in his shirt pocket. "His name is Robert Holt," Caleb said, "Sheriff of Crockett County." He looked at the water in the depression, which was brown and still and held a flat reflection of the iron sky. "3 years ago my wife was killed. She was driving the buckboard back from town on a Wednesday evening, and a man named Fitch drove his wagon into her on the road. He had been drinking since morning." He paused. "Fitch is Holt's first cousin." The water was very still. Holt closed the investigation, ruled it an accident. Death by misadventure, which is a phrase that means we have decided not to look at this more carefully. He stopped. "In exchange, I did not pursue the matter, and when the dispute over the water rights on my eastern boundary came before the county commissioner, I withdrew my claim." He had said all of this with the same flat tone he used for practical arrangements for the weather and the cattle and the distance to Dodge City, and hearing it in that tone was, he discovered, a different experience from the way it had sounded inside his head for 3 years, where it had a different quality entirely. Something less like a recitation of facts and more like the sound a wound makes when it is pressed. Naya was quiet for a long time. The cattle grazed around them. A red-tailed hawk made 3 slow circles above the draw to the north, and then was gone. "Do you regret it?" she said. The question arrived without accusation or sympathy, the way she delivered most of her questions stripped of everything except the thing it was actually asking. He considered it seriously. "Every day," he said, "and I would do it again. That is the part I cannot reconcile." She looked at him. "You would do it again to keep the ranch?" "Yes." "The ranch that your wife loved?" He had not thought of it in precisely those terms before. The weight of the phrasing hit him somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. "Yes," he said. Naya handed Rem's reins from her right hand to her left and looked out across the gray grass toward the north. "My father made accommodations too," she said. "Things he did not do because doing them would have cost him more than he was willing to pay. He carried that." A pause. "He carried it until he could not carry it any more, and then he gave it to me in a piece of leather." Caleb looked at her. "The difference," she said, "between what your Holt did and what Red Hawk did is not the kind of difference that makes one acceptable and the other not. It is only the kind of difference that determines the size of the shadow." He thought about this. "What do you do with it?" he said. "The shadow." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Then you stop letting it tell you who you are. You decide that yourself." The red-tailed hawk appeared again above the draw, made one more circle, and this time continued north. Caleb watched it until it was out of sight. He had been carrying the letter from Holt for 3 years in the outside pocket of the saddlebag where he could not forget it was there, and he had never been able to articulate to himself exactly why he kept it, rather than burning it. Since burning it would have changed nothing, and reading it again and again also changed nothing, and the whole exercise of keeping it was therefore without practical justification. Standing beside a brown waterhole in the Texas Panhandle on a cold gray afternoon in October, watching a hawk fly north toward Dodge City, he thought he understood for the first time what the letter actually was. It was not evidence, and it was not a reminder, and it was not a punishment. It was a door he had not been able to open and had not been able to walk away from, and he had been carrying it because some part of him had been waiting for the moment when walking through it became possible. He thought about Naya's leather cylinder. He thought about Edmund Price's unmarked grave somewhere south of the Canadian River. He thought about a federal marshal in Dodge City and what a conversation with such a man might accomplish and what it might require, and whether the arithmetic of that particular exchange might be different from the arithmetic he had been doing for 3 years. He did not say any of this out loud. But that night when the fire was low and the cattle were quiet in the draw, and the stars had come back out after the gray day with a particular brilliance that cold, clear nights on the Panhandle produce, Caleb put more wood on the fire than he usually did, enough to burn for several hours, and he sat beside it in the dark and let it burn. Naya was asleep on the far side of the fire, her breathing, the slow-changed breathing of genuine sleep, and the calf she had saved was curled at the edge of the warmth, with its mother standing close beside it, and the stars were enormous overhead, and the silence had a quality to it that was different from the silence of the previous 11 nights. It was the silence of a place where 2 people have set down something heavy. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the letter from Holt and held it over the fire. He held it there for a long time. Then he put it back in his pocket. Not yet. There was a right way to do this, and there was a wrong way, and the right way required Dodge City and a federal marshal and a conversation that needed to happen before any letter got burned or submitted or acted upon, and the wrong way was every other sequence. He banked the fire and lay back on his bedroll and looked at the stars. He was nearly asleep when dust shifted at the picket line, not the restless weight-shifting of a horse that needs water, the other kind. The kind that means something in the dark has changed. He was on his feet with the rifle before the sound had fully resolved into meaning. He stood still for 2 minutes listening. The cattle were quiet. The stars were where they were supposed to be. Whatever had moved had stopped moving. He did not sleep after that. At first light, he walked the southern perimeter the way he did every morning, and he found the steer 50 yards below the camp. Its throat had been cut in a single clean stroke, low and precise, the kind of cut that knows exactly where to go. Not a predator. Predators do not make clean strokes. Predators make a mess of things because they are hungry, and hunger is not careful. This was careful. He stood over the animal for a long moment and looked at it and thought about what it cost and what it was meant to cost, and what the difference between those 2 numbers said about the man who had made the calculation. When he came back to camp, Naya was already watching him cross the distance between them. She had not rebuilt the fire yet. She was sitting with her knees pulled up and her eyes on him, and she did not ask what he had found because the answer was in the way he was walking. He poured the last of the previous night's coffee into his cup. Cold. He drank it anyway. She said nothing. He said nothing. Between them, the understanding settled the way cold settles without announcement into everything. Somewhere to the south, he knew 2 men were sitting at 2 small fires, keeping pace with the herd, carrying out instructions from a man who needed something that was now riding in a carpet bag on the back of Naya's horse, and who had shown in the killing of Edmund Price and the engineering of Lone Bear's convenient early death and the cutting of a ranch steer's throat in the dark, to send a message that he was not the kind of man who stopped wanting what he wanted simply because the wanting was inconvenient for someone else. He was also not the kind of man who announced his moves in advance, and neither Caleb thought was the man lying in the dark with his rifle beside him and his eyes open and the stars wheeling slowly overhead and the cattle breathing in the draw around him and the woman sleeping on the far side of the fire with a leather cylinder in her bag that was either the end of something or the beginning of something, depending entirely on what the next 2 weeks of the Western Trail decided to produce. He lay there in the cold and he thought about all of this, and above him the stars moved in their ancient and indifferent patterns, and the fire burned down by degrees, and eventually the darkness began to thin in the east, and the 12th day became the 13th, and Caleb Turner rose before the light was fully up and went to make the coffee. When he turned around, Naya was already awake. She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, looking south, her face composed and still in the early gray light, her eyes steady on the horizon, and he understood from the quality of her stillness that she had been awake for some time, perhaps all night, watching the direction from which trouble would come when it came. He poured coffee into both cups and carried hers across the camp and set it on the ground beside her without speaking. She picked it up with both hands. They watched the south together while the light came in and the cattle began to stir around them, and another day on the western trail assembled itself out of the cold October air, and Dodge City was still far enough away to be a destination rather than a certainty, and between here and there was everything that remained to be decided. The morning of the 18th day began the way mornings had begun for as long as Caleb could remember, with the sound of cattle shifting in the pre-dawn dark, and the particular cold that arrives in the last hour before sunrise, as though testing the world's commitment to warmth before allowing the sun to make its argument. Caleb had been up since 3. The herd count was the first thing done twice in the dark, the way he always did it when something felt unresolved moving through the sleeping animals, with his hand touching flanks and reading the warmth of them. 78. The number sat in his chest with the specific weight of arithmetic that has already been accepted but not yet made peace with. The second thing was the horizon to the south, which told him nothing, which was itself a kind of information. He had counted the herd twice in the dark, 78 head. The steer that Red Hawk's men had killed in the night of the message was a fixed loss not recoverable. The one that had gone in the stampede was similarly gone. 2 more had wandered in the confusion of that night and had not been found despite an hour of searching the following morning. 78 was the number, and the number was what it was, and the arithmetic of Dodge City had adjusted accordingly, and the adjustment was uncomfortable but survivable, which was the most that could be said for most of the adjustments life required. What he had not counted because it could not be counted was the distance that had closed between himself and Naya over the preceding 6 days, since the night of the leather cylinder and the letter and the brown water hole, and the things that had been said and not said beside it. It was not a romantic distance, or not only that, or not yet that. It was the distance that exists between 2 people who have shown each other the shape of their damage and discovered that the shapes are not incompatible. This was rarer than it sounded. In Caleb's experience, which was not inconsiderable on the subject of human nature, if limited in its sample size, most people's damage was shaped in ways that made it difficult to stand close to other people's damage without one set of wounds pressing on the other. What he had found in the past 6 days in the careful and largely unspoken way that 2 people on a cattle drive in the Texas Panhandle find things about each other was that Naya's damage and his own damage occupied different enough shapes that they could exist in proximity without aggravating each other. This was not a small thing. It was in fact the largest thing that had happened to him in 3 years, though he had not yet found the language for it that he trusted. Dodge City appeared on the northern horizon at mid-morning of the 18th day. Not the city itself, but the evidence of it, a smudge of coal smoke and the distant thread of locomotive sound, and the particular way the sky above a cattle town looks different from the sky above open country, heavier and more purposeful, carrying the weight of human intention in it. Caleb reined dust to a halt and looked at it for a moment. 78 head, 2 days at the current pace. The western trail running straight and rutted from the use of the thousands of head that had gone north along it before his, a road made not by planning, but by repetition, by the accumulated passage of cattle and the men who drove them toward the place where the railroad waited to carry them east to the slaughterhouses and the money. He had made this drive before twice, both times with hired hands, and both times with more cattle than he had now. This was the first time he had made it alone, or what passed for alone, which was with one person riding the left flank who had been a stranger 18 days ago, and was now something that had no clean name in the vocabulary he had available. He heard Naya's horse come up beside him and stop. She looked at the smoke on the horizon without speaking. Her shoulder had healed adequately over the past 2 weeks, the movement returning gradually and the pain receding to something she no longer showed on her face, which did not mean it was gone, but meant she had decided it was not worth showing. The gray dress was beyond repair at this point, patched twice with strips of his spare shirt that she had asked for and he had given without discussion. She had braided her hair in the Kiowa way over the past week, a change from the mission school arrangement she had arrived with, and the change had happened without comment from either of them, the way most changes between them happened quietly and without ceremony. She was holding the leather cylinder against her leg with her right hand. She had been holding it more openly over the past 3 days, not displaying it but not concealing it either, and Caleb had understood this as a preparation of some kind, a readying of herself for what Dodge City required, the way a man cleans and checks his rifle before entering territory where he expects to need it. 2 days, he said. Yes. They rode on. The afternoon passed without incident, which Caleb had learned over 18 days to treat not as reassurance, but as information. The absence of incident had its own texture, and the texture of this absence was different from the texture of the absences that had preceded the letter from Red Hawk's men in the cut steer, different from the absence that had preceded the rider on the ridge, different from the absences that had simply been absences. This one had a quality of held breath to it, the stillness of a thing that is gathering itself before it moves. He had not seen Red Hawk's riders in 4 days. What he had seen on the morning of the 15th day was a rider he did not recognize sitting a gray horse on the road ahead, watching the herd come north with the particular stillness of someone counting rather than observing. Not a drover, not a traveler. The man had turned and ridden west when Caleb closed to within 200 yards, unhurried the way a man rides away from something when he has already finished what he came to do. Caleb had put it aside at the time because the herd needed his attention and because a single unfamiliar rider on the western trail was not by itself evidence of anything except the fact that other people also used the road. He was less certain of that now. This was not reassuring. Men who follow you and want something from you and are willing to kill a steer to demonstrate their seriousness do not stop following you 4 days from their objective. They stop being visible. The distinction was significant. He told Naya this at the end of the driving day when the cattle were settled in a broad, flat area where the grass was adequate and the sight lines were long in all directions, which he had chosen deliberately. "I know," she said. She was eating the last of the dried beef they had been rationing for a week, eating it slowly in the way you eat things when you want them to last longer than they are going to last. Red Hawk is not a patient man, but he is a strategic one. He will not move until the moment is best for him. What moment is best for him? She looked at the fire. When we are close enough to Dodge City that retreating is not possible for us, far enough that no one in the town can hear anything. Caleb turned this over. Tonight. Tomorrow night, she said. Tonight we are still a full day out. Tomorrow night we are close enough to push through to the town in the dark if we had to. He will not want to give us that option. He looked at her. You have thought about this. I have thought about nothing else for 18 days, she said without inflection, as though this were simply a fact about the landscape that needed acknowledging. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you walk toward my fire that first night? You knew they were behind you. You knew stopping increased your risk." She set down the last piece of dried beef and looked at it for a moment. Because I had been walking for 4 days and I had not eaten in 2, and I had come to the calculation that dying of cold and exhaustion in the dark was not meaningfully different from dying of Red Hawk's decision in the dark, and at least your fire was warm. She picked up the dried beef again. And because there was something about the way your fire was built, small and careful, the fire of someone who does not waste things. I thought a man who does not waste wood is probably a man who does not waste other things either. He absorbed this. That is a significant inference from a campfire. I was cold and hungry, and I needed to make a fast decision. People make inferences from whatever evidence is available. The fire burned between them, and the stars came out above the Panhandle, and the cattle moved slowly in the dark around the edges of the light. That night, Caleb did not sleep at all. He sat with his back against his saddle and his rifle across his lap, and he watched the darkness in every direction with the sustained attention of a man who has decided that vigilance is the price of the next 2 days and is willing to pay it. Sometime after midnight, he heard Naya sit up on her side of the fire, and after a moment she came around and sat beside him, close her own back against the saddle skirt she used as a pillow, and she watched the darkness on the side he was not watching. They did not speak. They sat in the dark and watched, and the night passed around them in its slow planetary way, and nothing came out of it. At some point, without either of them intending it or deciding it, her shoulder came to rest against his. Neither of them moved away. The stars finished their arc. The sky began to change in the east. The cattle stirred. Another day assembled itself out of the cold October air, and Caleb Turner stood and reached down and offered her his hand, and she took it and stood, and they broke camp and moved the herd north toward the smoke on the horizon that was Dodge City getting closer. The trouble came in the afternoon. It came as Naya had predicted from the east. Red Hawk had circled wide in the night, moving around the northern edge of their position, while his 2 riders stayed south as a known quantity, as a thing being watched, while he himself moved to the position from which he would have the most leverage. He was alone when he rode out of the draw to the east and positioned himself between the herd and the northern horizon. A single rider sitting a paint horse with the absolute stillness of a man who has chosen this moment carefully and intends to extract everything it offers. Caleb saw him and reined dust to a halt and looked at him for a long count. Then he turned to Naya. "Hold the herd here. Keep them from drifting north." She looked at Red Hawk on the horizon, then at Caleb. Something moved in her face, a brief, complicated thing, and then she nodded and moved Rem to the front of the herd to hold the lead animals in place. Caleb rode out alone. He stopped Dust 20 yards from Red Hawk, and they looked at each other across the dry grass in the afternoon light. Red Hawk was perhaps 50 years old, with the broad face and heavy-boned frame of a man who had lived his whole life outdoors in extreme conditions and been shaped by them the way wood is shaped by weather, not broken but altered, hardened in some places, and made unexpectedly supple in others. He wore a long coat that was neither Indian nor white, but some pragmatic combination of both, and he sat his horse with a comfort that suggested the horse and the man had reached an arrangement that benefited both of them over many years. He looked at Caleb with the particular assessment of a man who respects intelligence in an opponent without being required to like him. "Mr. Turner," he said. His English was precise, the English of someone who had learned it as a tool rather than a language who used it when it was the most efficient instrument available. Caleb said nothing. "The woman carries something that belongs to my family," Red Hawk said. "I want it returned." "It does not belong to your family," Caleb said. "It was made by your father for your sister. That makes it hers." A brief pause. "Half-sister. The leather does not know the difference." Red Hawk looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it the expression of a man who encounters unexpected competence from a direction he had not anticipated and takes a moment to recalibrate. "You know what she carries." "I know what she carries." "Then you know that it represents a significant inconvenience for me." "I know what it represents," Caleb said. "And I know what the word inconvenience means to a man who considers murder a reasonable solution to a business problem." The adjacent to amusement expression went away. They looked at each other. "I know about Robert Holt," Red Hawk said. His voice had not changed in volume or pace, but something in its quality had shifted, a slight increase in the weight behind the words, the way a man adjusts his grip when he prepares to apply pressure. "I know about your wife. I know about the arrangement you made to protect your ranch." He paused. "I am in a position to ensure that Sheriff Holt never mentions that arrangement again, permanently, in exchange for what my sister is carrying." Caleb sat on Dust and looked at the horizon beyond Red Hawk's shoulder, where the smoke of Dodge City was visible and the thread of locomotive sound was occasionally audible when the wind was right. "No," he said. Red Hawk was quiet for a moment. "You understand what I am offering?" "I understand it completely. And no. The man who covered up your wife's death walks free. He will continue to walk free. Nothing about that changes whether you hand me what I am asking for or not. The only thing that changes is the size of your problems going forward." Caleb looked at him directly. "Holt does not honor arrangements. Men like Holt do not honor arrangements because honoring arrangements requires a kind of consistency that men like Holt do not possess. He honored ours for 3 years because I stayed quiet and stayed in Crockett County and never became a problem for him. The moment I become a problem, the arrangement ends regardless of what you promise me." Something shifted in Red Hawk's face. It was minimal, the shift, but it was there. "You have already decided to become a problem," Red Hawk said. "I decided that sometime in the last 18 days, Caleb said. "I am still working out the details." Red Hawk looked past him toward Naya, who was holding the herd from the front with the stillness of someone who is using all of their attention to do one thing and has nothing left over for anything else. "She cannot live in your world," Red Hawk said. "She does not fit in it. She has a mission school education and a Kiowa face, and she is half of 2 things that do not want her. Dodge City will make this clear to her." He paused. "She belongs with her people. She was thrown out by her people. By me, not by her people. You are her people's leader. The distinction is academic." Red Hawk was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass between them. "You have 1 night to reconsider," he said. "I will not offer again." He turned his horse and rode east and did not look back. Caleb sat on dust and watched him go, and then turned and rode back to the herd. Naya was watching him. He rode up beside her, and they were quiet together for a moment while the cattle milled around them. "What did he offer you?" she said. He told her. All of it the same way he told her everything now, without editing and without the softening that he would have applied 3 weeks ago. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "And I said no." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was going orange and long, and it fell across her face in the way that the late light on the Panhandle falls across everything, making it look like a thing worth keeping. "He told you I do not fit in your world," she said. "Yes." "He is not entirely wrong." "He is wrong about what it means," Caleb said. "Not fitting into a place and not having a right to try are different things." She looked at the smoke on the northern horizon. She looked at her hands on the reins. She looked at the leather cylinder that was tied now to the front of her saddle where she could reach it in any direction. "He will come tonight," she said. "I know." "Not for conversation." "I know." She untied the leather cylinder from the saddle and held it out to him. "If something happens to me, a federal marshal, not the sheriff." He took it. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was less than he expected and more than he expected at the same time. Then he tied it to his own saddle alongside his rifle and looked at her. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for statements that she found both touching and inadequate. "You cannot know that." "No, but I can make it significantly more difficult." Something in her face changed. It was not the partial, almost smile she sometimes produced, not the expression of polite disbelief she wore when he said things she found naive. It was something more open than both of those things, something that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Or if it had been there, it had been locked behind a door she had not yet seen a reason to open. "Caleb," she said. He waited. "Thank you. Not for what you are about to do, for putting the cup on the ground 18 nights ago." He looked at the cattle moving around them in the long afternoon light. 78 animals who had no idea what the next 18 hours contained and were entirely at peace with their ignorance. "You're welcome," he said. Red Hawk did not wait until midnight. He came at 2 hours before dawn, which was earlier than Caleb had expected, and which told him something important about the degree of Red Hawk's concern, which was that it was high enough to override his preference for the strategic patience he had demonstrated over 18 days, high enough that he was willing to give up the darkness of the deepest hours, the hours when human alertness is at its lowest, in exchange for the time he needed to be clear of the area before the light came up. Caleb was already sitting up when he heard the horses. He had been sitting up since midnight, not because he was certain of the timing, but because he was certain of the direction, which was all he needed. He had moved the camp before dark, not far, perhaps 200 yards east of where they had made their evening fire, into a low depression in the caprock where the ground gave them a slight elevation advantage on 3 sides. He had made a fire in the original campsite, a small one enough to be visible from the south, and he had arranged his bedroll beside it with his spare saddle blanket shaped beneath it in the suggestion of a sleeping person, which was a deception he doubted would fool Red Hawk for long, but which might buy the 2 or 3 seconds that made the difference between various outcomes. Naya was on his right, lying flat in the grass at the edge of the depression, and she had the knife that had lived in her boot for 18 days in her right hand, and she was watching the southern approach with the focused stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and is now entirely prepared for its arrival. They came from 2 directions simultaneously. Red Hawk had divided his 3 remaining riders, which was tactically sound and which Caleb had anticipated. 2 came from the south toward the decoy fire with a directness that suggested they had been watching the location for some time. 1 came from the west in a wide arc cutting around toward the position where the horses were picketed. Caleb let the 2 southern riders get within 60 yards of the decoy fire before he fired once into the air. The sound of the shot in the flat pre-dawn dark was enormous, the kind of sound that reorganizes everything around it, that arrives before anyone has time to prepare a response to it. And in the second after it, the world contained only the echo and the ringing and the sudden frantic movement of 78 longhorn cattle who had been asleep 30 seconds ago and were now in the early stages of stampede. It was not the outcome Caleb had been hoping for, but it was the outcome he had planned for. The cattle moved north. They always moved north when startled, because north was the direction they had been traveling for 18 days, and direction becomes habit, and habit survives panic in ways that rational thought does not. They moved north in a mass that was not yet a full stampede, but was accelerating toward one, and between the herd moving north and Red Hawk's men approaching from the south, there was a window of approximately 45 seconds in which the geography was entirely to Caleb's advantage. He used 30 of those seconds to move from the depression to the horses, which were not where Red Hawk's western rider expected them to be, because Caleb had moved them east as well when he moved the camp. He united Dust and Rem in the dark and led them north 50 yards behind the moving herd, and then stopped and turned. Naya was beside him. She had come from the left, moving fast and low through the grass with the efficiency of someone who had grown up moving through country at night without wanting to be heard, and she reached the horses and took Rem's reins from him and swung up in one motion that she completed before he had finished watching her begin it. The western rider had found the empty picket and was casting around in the dark, his horse uncertain. The 2 southern riders had reached the decoy fire and found the shaped saddle blanket, and Caleb could hear at a distance of 100 yards the sound of that discovery being processed. Red Hawk himself had not yet appeared. This was the thing that Caleb had not accounted for, the variable he could not plan around, because he did not know enough to plan around it. He had planned for 3 riders. He had accounted for 3 riders. Red Hawk himself was a 4th, and the 4th was the one who concerned him most, because Red Hawk was not operating on the basis of orders. He was operating on the basis of understanding, which was more adaptable and therefore more dangerous. He found out where Red Hawk was 30 seconds later, when the man stepped out of the darkness to his right and spoke. "The cattle are going to run all the way to Dodge City," Red Hawk said. His voice was entirely level. "That is probably good for you. Easier to count them when they arrive." Caleb turned. Red Hawk was standing 10 feet away. He had a rifle, but it was not raised. He was standing in the dark in his long coat, and he was looking not at Caleb but at Naya, with an expression that Caleb could not fully read in the dark, but that contained something complicated, something that was not purely strategic. "Naya," Red Hawk said in Kiowa. She said nothing. She sat on Rem and looked at her half-brother across the dark grass. He said something in Kiowa, a longer sentence. His voice had changed, the precision of the English he used for negotiation replaced by something rougher and less controlled, a voice that had been used this way since childhood and had not been carefully arranged before deployment. Naya answered in Kiowa. One sentence, short and final, the sound of a door being closed. Red Hawk looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb, and something in his face underwent a change that Caleb had not expected, a partial and incomplete and almost invisible change, but a change from the expression of a man conducting a strategic operation to the expression of a man who has arrived at the far edge of what he was willing to do and has found it further than he is comfortable with. "She belongs with her people," he said, back in English, which told Caleb the sentence was for him. "You keep saying that," Caleb said. "What I notice is that her people threw her out, which means either she does not belong with them or the idea of belonging is more complicated than you are allowing for." Red Hawk looked at him. "The document she carries will not be believed," Red Hawk said. "White courts do not believe Kiowa testimony." "It is not testimony," Caleb said. "It is a map, with a body at the end of it, and a letter from a man who spent 20 years leading your band and who is beyond any pressure you can apply to him now." Red Hawk was quiet. "Edmund Price had a family," Caleb said. "In Missouri. He had a wife and 3 children who have spent a year believing he died in an accident on the open plains. One of those children is old enough to read a deposition. One of them wrote to the Indian agent at Anadarko asking for information. He had learned this from the marshal's correspondence that Naya had summarized for him from memory during the long evenings of the drive. The family of a dead white man and a federal marshal and a document drawn by a Kiowa chief is a different thing from a Kiowa woman's testimony in a county court." Another silence. Red Hawk's rifle was still not raised. From the south came the sound of his 2 riders working back toward his position, having sorted out what they had found. From the north came the diminishing thunder of 78 longhorn cattle moving toward Dodge City under their own momentum. "If I let her go," Red Hawk said very quietly to no one in particular, "it does not end." "No," Caleb agreed, "but it ends differently than if you do not." Something crossed Red Hawk's face that Caleb could not name and did not try to. It lasted less than a second, and then it was gone, and Red Hawk was looking at him with the same strategic assessment he had brought to every previous encounter. "My riders," Red Hawk said. "Will find their horses and go home," Caleb said, "if that is what you decide." Another long silence. Then Red Hawk said something to Naya in Kiowa. 3 words. Short and final, a different kind of finality from the door-closing finality of her response to him, more like the finality of something being set down. Naya received it without visible reaction. But something in how she sat on Rem changed, a barely perceptible release of something she had been holding, and Caleb filed this away without examining it, because this was not the moment for examination. Red Hawk turned and walked into the dark toward the south. His riders, when they arrived at his position, found nothing. The camp was empty. The horses were gone. The fire had burned down to ash. Caleb sat on dust in the dark and listened to the sound of horses moving south, and then the sound of nothing at all. "What did he say?" he said. "At the end." Naya was looking south. "He said you are your mother's daughter." She paused. "It is not a compliment in Kiowa. It means you are not fully one of us." Another pause, shorter. "But from him tonight I think it meant something else. I think it meant he has known for a long time that this was going to happen, and he has finished pretending otherwise." Caleb absorbed this. Will he honor it? I do not know, but I know he understands consequences now in a way he did not before. Red Hawk is strategic. Strategic men do not make moves they cannot survive. She turned Rem north. "We should go find the cattle." They found them 1.5 miles north, milling in a broad area of flat ground where the stampede had lost its energy and collapsed into confusion. It took them 1.5 hours in the dark to settle the herd and count the animals and determine that all 78 were accounted for, which was a fact that seemed in the cold pre-dawn dark of the Panhandle improbably fortunate and worth acknowledging as such. Caleb counted twice to be sure. 78. He sat on dust and looked at the number in his mind, and then he looked at Naya, who was riding the far edge of the settled herd with the unhurried precision she brought to everything. And he thought about the drive from its beginning to this moment, all the miles of it, all the days and nights, and the storms and the stampedes and the fires and the silences, and the things said and not said. And he thought about how different the arithmetic of this morning was from the arithmetic of the morning 18 days ago, when he had built his small, careful fire south of the Canadian River crossing and begun to work at the frayed rope. The sun came up over the caprock and turned everything gold. They drove north. Dodge City received them at mid-afternoon of the 19th day, the way Dodge City received all cattle drives in the fall of 1874, which was with the organized chaos of a place that had built its entire economy around the convergence of cattle and railroad and the money that flowed between them. The pens were to the east of the main street, and the smell reached them a mile out, and the noise of the place, the constant low roar of a working cattle town operating at capacity, was a different kind of noise from anything they had lived inside for 19 days. Caleb drove the cattle into the holding pens and counted them into the pen as they went through the gate. 78. He wrote the number down in the small notebook he carried and closed it and put it away. Naya was beside him at the gate. She had been quiet since they came in sight of the town. A different quality of quiet from the working quiet of the drive, a more internal quiet, the quiet of someone watching a place approach that they have been moving toward for a long time and that is now close enough to require a decision about what happens next. "Marshal's office," she said, not as a question. "I will take you," he said. She looked at him. "You do not have to." "I know." They went together. Marshal Tom Bridges was a compact man of about 45 with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who has held authority long enough to have learned that authority exercised quietly is more durable than authority exercised loudly. He had a federal appointment and an office that was separate from the city sheriff's office, which was a distinction that mattered in 1874 in ways that were sometimes political and sometimes practical, and were on this occasion both. Naya placed the leather cylinder on his desk and gave him her name. Naya Lone Bear, daughter of Lone Bear, leader of the Kiowa band of the Texas Panhandle. Witness to the death of Edmund Price in the autumn of 1873. Bearer of her father's written account of that death and the man responsible for it. Bridges listened without interrupting. He asked 4 questions, all of them precise and none of them hostile. The questions of a man doing a job rather than protecting a position. He unrolled the leather cylinder and looked at the map and the notation with the attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He called his deputy in and showed him the map, and they conferred in low voices for a moment, and the deputy went out. "This will take time," Bridges said, looking at Naya with the directness of a man who believes in giving people accurate information rather than comfortable information. Federal proceedings involving Indian Territory and intertribal disputes and the death of a white civilian are complicated in ways that have nothing to do with the quality of the evidence. I want you to understand that." "I understand it," Naya said. "Your testimony will be required, which means Dodge City for at least a month, possibly longer." "I understand that too." Bridges looked at the leather cylinder and then at Caleb. "And you are?" "Caleb Turner. I drove the herd north with Miss Lone Bear. I am a corroborating witness to the threats made against her during the drive by Red Hawk." Bridges looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality of a man who is deciding what category to put you in. Then he nodded and reached for a pen. It took 2 hours. When they came out of the marshal's office, the sun was going down over Dodge City in the particular way that sunsets operate in Kansas in October, with a thoroughness and a color that seemed designed to make an argument about the value of the day that has just concluded. Naya stood on the boardwalk outside the office and looked at the street. The noise of Dodge City operated around her, the horses and the wagons and the voices and the piano sound coming from somewhere to the west and the constant underlying presence of the cattle pens to the east. She was still. Not the stillness of tension, not the stillness of someone managing fear or calculating a next move. A different stillness entirely. The stillness of someone who has set down something very heavy and is standing in the unfamiliar condition of not carrying it. Caleb stood beside her. After a moment she said, "It is strange. What is not knowing what to do next? I have known what to do next for 8 months. Walk north, find a marshal, give him the map. Every decision I made was in service of that sequence." She looked at the street. "Now the sequence is finished and I do not know what comes after it." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I need to sell 78 head of cattle. That is what comes next for me, if you want something to do while you figure out the other question." She looked at him. "The buyers are at the stockyard office," he said. "They will try to pay less than the cattle are worth. It helps to have someone who can count standing next to you." Something moved in her face. The almost smile which he had learned to identify in its earliest stages, which were barely visible and appeared only when something had genuinely surprised her. "I can count," she said. "I know." They walked to the stockyard office together. The buyer was a man named Pharaoh, who had the comfortable certainty of someone who buys cattle for a living and has found that cattle sellers are usually in enough of a hurry to accept less than full value. He looked at Caleb's count and offered a price that was 14% below the market rate for that quality of animal at that time in that market, which Caleb knew because he had been watching cattle prices for 20 years. Naya said, without having been asked, "That is 14% below the current market rate." Pharaoh looked at her. "The shorthorns that came through last week sold for $3.40 per hundredweight," she said. "Your longhorns are leaner, but they have walked 600 miles and they are healthy animals. $2.90 per hundredweight is not a fair price." Pharaoh looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Naya with an expression that was not quite the almost smile but was related to it. They settled at $3.15 per hundredweight. Caleb wrote down the final number and showed it to Naya, who verified the arithmetic without being asked and indicated with a minimal nod that it was correct. He collected the money, and they walked out of the stockyard office into the evening air. He counted out her wages. 4 weeks. $1 a day, plus the extra $half he had promised. He held the money out to her. She took it. She counted it. Then she held out half of it. "Buy feed for Dust," she said. "She has earned better than trail grass." He looked at the money in her hand. "That is yours," he said. "I know. I have the other half. That is enough for what I need in Dodge City." She looked at him steadily. "You drove 600 miles and lost 4 head of cattle that you would not have lost without me. The feed is less than the cost of 1 steer." He could not argue with the arithmetic. He took the money. They stood on the street outside the stockyard office in the last of the evening light, and the noise of Dodge City moved around them, and it occurred to Caleb that they had arrived at a moment he had been aware of approaching for several days and had not known how to think about or prepare for, and had therefore simply not thought about, because the drive and the cattle and Red Hawk and the marshal had provided sufficient present-tense occupation that the future had been a theoretical country he had not needed to enter. He had a train ticket to buy and a bank payment to arrange, and a ranch 2 days south that needed him back in it before winter arrived with its opinions about unfinished preparations. He had the specific and manageable arithmetic of a man who knows what he owes and what he has and can calculate the difference. He looked at Naya. She was watching him do the arithmetic. She had gotten very good at watching him do the arithmetic, or perhaps she had always been good at it, at reading the working in a face that he had believed for 3 years was unreadable. "The ranch," she said. "Yes." "How long before you need to leave?" "I need to arrange the bank transfer today. I can be on the road tomorrow morning." She nodded slowly. She looked at the street. She looked at the marshal's office 2 blocks east. She looked at her hands. "I will be in Dodge City for at least a month," she said. Bridges was not overstating the complexity. "I know." "The ranch is 2 days south." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. What passed between them in that moment did not have language adequate to it, or perhaps the language existed, but neither of them reached for it because reaching for it felt like the wrong motion for what the moment required. What the moment required was simpler and more specific than language, and it was only available in the space between 2 people who have looked at each other across 18 days of open country and storms and danger and things set in the dark and have arrived without planning to, at the recognition that the space between them has closed in ways that cannot be reopened by returning to where they started. "Midsummer," she said finally. "If the proceedings go as Bridges suggested, the formal testimony will be done by midsummer." "The ranch will need work before midsummer," Caleb said. "The east fence was down before I left. The roof on the smaller barn needs replacing. There is a creek on the south boundary that has been silting up and needs to be cleared before the spring rains." She looked at him. "That is a great deal of work for one person," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I have been managing it for 3 years. I would not recommend it." She looked at the street again, and then at the sky, which had gone to the deep, clear blue of a Panhandle evening, that particular blue that exists for perhaps 20 minutes between sunset and full dark, and that has no equivalent anywhere else. $1.50 a day, she said. He considered. "Room and board included." "A room of my own." "The bunkhouse is separate from the house. You would have it to yourself until the spring hiring." "Dust," she said. "Has a stall," he said. A silence. The sky went from blue toward the first intimation of dark. "There is a question I need to ask you," Naya said. "Ask it." "When Red Hawk said I do not fit in your world," she looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she wanted to see accurately. "Was he wrong?" Caleb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about Dodge City and Crockett County and the world that Robert Holt and the county commissioner and the bank in Abilene constituted, the world that had its systems and its expectations and its 1,000 small mechanisms for telling people where they belonged and where they did not. "He was wrong about whether it matters," Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. "That is not the same as being wrong about whether it is true," she said. "No, but it is the more important question." Another silence. A wagon went past on the street. From somewhere to the west, the piano was still playing a simple, repeated phrase, patient and unhurried. "I have thought about midsummer," she said finally. He waited. "I think it is a reasonable timeline," she said, "for someone who is in the middle of a legal proceeding and for someone who has a great deal of work to do on a ranch before spring." "It is," he said, "a reasonable timeline." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. Her hand was calloused from the reins and the rope work of the drive, and his was scarred in the specific places that barbed wire and saddle leather scar hands over 15 years of ranching, and they fit together in the particular way that things fit that have been shaped by the same kind of work over the same kind of years. They shook hands. Then she let go and walked back toward the marshal's office, and he watched her go and then turned and walked toward the stockyard bank and the practical arrangements of the rest of the day. He left Dodge City the next morning in the early light, with Dust fed and rested, and the bank draft arranged, and the long road south opening in front of him, the way long roads open all at once and without ceremony. He rode for an hour in silence. The Kansas grass went past on either side, and the sky did its enormous Texas border thing, and Dust moved beneath him with the settled contentment of a horse who has eaten well and has a direction. He thought about the ranch, the east fence, the barn roof, the silting creek on the south boundary, the specific and manageable arithmetic of what needed doing before midsummer. He thought about a leather cylinder now lodged in a federal marshal's office in Dodge City that had traveled 600 miles from its origin and arrived at the only place it could do what it had been made to do. He thought about a woman in that same city who was sitting across a desk from a man with a federal appointment and was saying in the careful English of someone who learned it as a tool the things that needed to be said about what she had seen in the dark by a creek in the autumn of 1873. He thought about midsummer. He did not ride fast. There was no reason to ride fast. The ranch was 2 days south, and it would be there when he arrived, and the work would be there, and the silence that he had lived in for 3 years would be there. And he thought about that silence now with a different kind of attention than he had brought to it for the past 3 years. It was not, he thought, the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of a space that had been given a purpose, a space that was waiting in the patient way that spaces wait for the thing that was going to fill it to arrive. He rode south. The Panhandle morning came down around him in long stripes of pale October gold, and ahead of him the road ran straight and purposeful toward the horizon, and somewhere behind him in Dodge City the machinery of justice was beginning its slow, complicated work, and he was a man on a horse going home. For the first time in a long time, home was a place he was going toward, rather than a place he was simply in. He did not look back. He did not need to. Some things once set in motion do not require watching. They simply go where they are going at the pace they are going, and they arrive when they arrive, and the arriving is enough. The road went south. Caleb Turner rode it. Above him the sky was very blue and very large. The way the sky above the Texas Panhandle is always very blue and very large, enormous and indifferent, and somehow on this particular morning not indifferent at all.